Trace Calder believed that staying had a price, and he'd paid it once, with everything. The wind came down dry hollow before dawn, sharp and unseasonal, cutting across the valley with a cold that didn't belong there. It bent the grass flat and carried a thin grit of frost that clung to stone and shadow. This was not winter's work, just a reminder that the land did what it wanted, when it wanted, and never explained itself. Trace Calder felt it long before he saw it, the way the air pressed against his lungs, the way silence tightened, as if waiting. He lived alone at the edge of the hollow, where the ground dipped and the creek ran only when it remembered how. No neighbors, no visitors, no reason for conversation. His ranch was built for use, not comfort. Weathered boards, a low roof, fences mended just enough to hold. He didn't go into town, didn't linger where questions could form. In places like this, questions led to obligations, and obligations had a way of killing men. Trace believed in limits, in distance, in the idea that survival depended less on courage than on knowing when to turn away. He had learned that lesson the hard way. That morning, he followed the creek bed as he always did after a hard wind, checking for washouts and broken stones. The water was gone, pulled back into the earth weeks earlier, leaving only pale rock and mud hardened into shallow cracks. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the light lay thin and gray over the valley. That was when he saw the marks. Footprints, uneven, dragging, pressed deep where the ground softened. They crossed the creek bed at an angle that made no sense, weaving as if the person who made them had lost their balance more than once. The spacing told a story Trace didn't need explained. Whoever had walked here hadn't been steady, hadn't been strong. He followed them a few yards farther. She lay near the bank where stone met earth, collapsed on her side, dark hair spilled forward to hide her face. A young Apache woman. Her clothing was travel-worn, torn at the hem, dusted with frost. One hand was clenched around nothing at all. Trace stopped. The world narrowed to the sound of his own breath and the weight of the Winchester in his hands. He didn't raise it. He didn't lower it. He stood exactly where he was, boots planted, body locked in a stillness that had kept him alive more than once. The footprints told him she'd come a long way. Too long. Each step had cost her something she didn't have to spare. The land didn't forgive that kind of debt. Trace knew better than most what happened when you tried to settle accounts the valley hadn't agreed to. He could leave. Step back the way he'd come. Let the wind erase the tracks by noon. Let the land finish what it had started. It wouldn't be cruel. It would just be what the valley did. His grip tightened on the rifle. The memory came uninvited, as it always did when he hesitated. A different morning. A different choice. The day he had stayed when leaving would have been safer. The day he had believed holding ground mattered more than distance. By the time he understood the cost, it was already paid. Mary's voice gone from the house. Evan's small cup left untouched on the shelf. Trace had learned then that staying wasn't brave. It was expensive. The woman by the creek didn't move. No sound, no plea. The wind brushed over her and kept going. Trace felt the familiar urge rise. Measured, disciplined, insistent. Walk away. Preserve what remains. Don't invite the past to repeat itself under a different name. He shifted his weight, just enough to ease the tension in his legs. The rifle dipped a fraction. Then he saw her chest move. Barely. Enough to be missed if you weren't looking for it. Enough to prove that whatever had driven her this far hadn't finished its work yet. Trace stood there a long moment, the valley stretched wide and indifferent around him. The land offered no guidance. It never did. He took a step toward her, only one, and then he stopped. The wind pressed harder, as if urging him to choose. Trace Calder remained where he was, caught between the man he had become and the life that still flickered, fragile and unclaimed, at his feet. The cold settled deeper as the sun rose slow behind the hills, casting no warmth across Dry Hollow. The frost clung harder now, like it meant to stay, and the wind came sharper than before, tugging at Trace Calder's coat as he stood frozen by the riverbank. The girl hadn't moved. He watched her chest carefully, searching for that faint lift he'd seen before, proof that she was still hanging on, by grit or mercy, or some last shred of strength. Then, like a curtain drawn by an unseen hand, her body gave out. One shoulder slipped. Her face dropped forward into the dust. Whatever was keeping her upright, fear, instinct, sheer will, had finally let go. She wasn't getting back up. Trace knew the land would finish what it started. He didn't breathe, didn't blink. It would be easier, cleaner to walk away. Let the wind erase her footprints. Let time carry her story to wherever such stories go when no one's around to hear them. But Trace Calder didn't move. He stood there, still as the rocks, still as the silence, rifle resting heavy in his grip. His mind ran fast, sharp and cold, like creek water in spring. If he walked away, nothing changed. She dies and he keeps breathing. If he stepped forward, everything changed. Maybe not right away, but sure as sunrise, trouble would come. This land didn't care for outsiders, and it sure as hell didn't forgive those who sheltered them. He could feel it already, how the rumors would start, how faces in town would harden just a little more, how the wrong kind of men might show up looking for someone to blame. Trace wasn't a fool, but neither was he deaf to his own conscience. So he moved. Not like a hero, not like a man chasing redemption, just one slow step across the frost-bitten grass. One choice he'd have to carry. He slung the rifle behind his shoulder and knelt beside her. Up close, she looked even younger. Her lips were chapped, skin pulled tight by cold and exhaustion. Her hands were scraped raw from rough land and long walking. But there was something in her jaw, set firm even in sleep, that spoke of grit. He reached to check her pulse, his touch careful, unsure. There, faint, uneven, but present. She was still here. Then a voice low and sharp broke the silence behind him. Step back. He didn't jump, just turned his head, slow, steady. A second figure stood 10 paces off, half shadowed by the sparse cottonwoods. An older woman, wrapped in worn deer skin and a deep red shawl, eyes dark as winter dusk. She hadn't made a sound coming in. Her stance wasn't overtly threatening, but the way she held herself spoke volumes. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't guessing. She was watching. And ready? Trace raised both hands slightly. I'm not here to hurt her. The woman didn't answer. Her gaze flicked from him to the girl and back again. She was alone when I found her, he said quietly. She's not gonna make it through another hour like this. Still, the woman said nothing. But something in her posture shifted. Not surrender, but consideration. He reached again, this time to lift the girl. Careful, steady, as if the land might break open beneath him if he rushed. She was light, bones in silence, her body limp against his chest. The older woman stepped closer, eyes never leaving his face. If she dies in your care, she won't, Trace cut in, calm but firm. Not if I can help it. They stared at each other for a beat longer, neither yielding. Then silently, the woman followed. Trace carried the girl toward the cabin that hadn't known another soul in years. Behind him, the wind died down for just a moment, and the sound of boots crunching frost echoed like judgment. The door creaked open. The door creaked open on its old hinges, the sound brittle in the cold morning light. Trace stepped through first, boots heavy with mud and frost, carrying the unconscious weight of the girl in his arms. The older woman, Tiva Redfeather, followed close behind, silent as smoke, eyes scanning every shadow inside. The cabin was small, sparse, built by necessity, not for company. A single room with low beams, a stone hearth, rough furniture worn by years of weather and grief. The second chair sat pushed against the wall, unused for so long that dust had formed a pale outline beneath its legs. On a narrow shelf near the window, a child's wooden cup rested, untouched, as if waiting for hands that would never return. Trace laid the girl down gently near the fire, on a bedroll that hadn't known another body in years. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, face tight with fever, lips parted just enough to let breath slip through. Her hair was tangled, matted with dirt and dried wind. But she didn't look fragile. She looked worn, like someone who had already come farther than most would dare. Tiva stepped in and dropped to her knees at her sister's side, one hand hovering protectively above her shoulder. She didn't speak, didn't thank him, just watched, every muscle in her body coiled tight, like she was ready to leap between them if Trace moved too fast. He didn't. Instead, he set about the work in silence. He built up the fire until the flames reached high, heat pushing back against the chill that had settled deep into the walls. He filled a pot with water from a barrel just outside and set it over the flame. Then he moved around the space with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done everything himself for a long time. Tiva followed his every move. He could feel her gaze like a knife at his back, untrusting, steady, waiting for a crack in his intent. But Trace didn't offer explanations, Not because he had something to hide, but because, in a place like this, words were as dangerous as bullets. He brought over a folded blanket, laid it near the girl's legs, and stepped back. No one said a thing for a long while. Outside, the wind knocked against the walls like it wanted to be let in. Inside, the only sounds were the hiss of fire, the boil of water, and the shallow breathing of the girl who had yet to wake. Trace leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, eyes downcast. He didn't know what he expected from this. Maybe that they'd leave as quietly as they'd come. Maybe that it'd be over before it became something he couldn't undo. But then she stirred. It started as a twitch in her hand, fingers curling slightly against the wool. Then her head shifted, just enough for her hair to fall back from her face. Her eyes opened. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to find him across the room. Tiva moved closer, placing a hand gently on her sister's forehead. The girl blinked slowly, lips dry, breath uneven. Trace didn't step forward. He didn't move at all. Then came the voice, weak, raspy, but clear. Why? One word, that was all. Trace met her gaze. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't afraid. She was searching, testing the man who had carried her here, who had said nothing, who had expected nothing in return. He didn't answer, not yet. He simply looked at her, then back at the fire. The kindling snapped, sending a sharp crack through the room. Tiva glanced at him for the first time without suspicion. Not warmth, not trust, but a pause. The kind you gave a man when you realized he hadn't yet proven himself, but also hadn't failed to. Trace remained quiet. In this house that still remembered love and loss, that held ghosts in corners and silence in rafters, he now stood with two strangers who didn't feel like strangers anymore. And the girl, her question still hanging in the air, closed her eyes once more. The question had settled in the air like dust that refused to drift away. Why? Trace didn't answer right away. He hadn't expected the girl, Rhea, to speak so soon, and he sure hadn't expected that question to be the first thing out of her mouth. He stared into the fire for a long moment after she closed her eyes again, letting the flicker of flame give him time to think. Not that he needed much. The truth was plain. It had always been plain. But truth didn't always feel right sitting in a man's mouth. Sometimes it felt too small for the weight it carried. So when the time came and she opened her eyes again, Trace kept his voice low and steady. Because you were still breathing. That was it. No explanation. No story to dress it up. And for Rhea Redfeather, it was enough. She blinked once, slowly, then let her eyes close again without another word. Tiva didn't say anything either, but her posture eased just slightly, barely more than a shift in the way she sat, but noticeable. She no longer placed herself so squarely between him and her sister. Still watchful, still guarded, but the edge had dulled. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. Inside, something quieter had begun to settle. The days that followed moved slow, marked by routine but not by silence. The fire stayed lit most hours. Water was boiled. Broth was made from dried meat and what roots Trace had left in the cellar. The air inside grew warm enough to keep the frost from creeping across the floorboards come night. Rhea's fever broke on the third day. Her strength returned by inches. She sat up on her own, then took sips of water, then broth. Her hands still trembled, but her gaze had regained that steady, unflinching focus from the first moment Trace had seen her. She said little, but what she said was clear. Tiva remained close, always tending to her sister, but now also helping where help was needed. Refilling water, folding cloth, sweeping ash from the hearth. She never asked what Trace thought of it. She simply did what had to be done, and Trace let her. He wasn't used to footsteps in his house that weren't his. He wasn't used to voices, not even soft ones, breaking the long stretch of quiet. And he wasn't used to sleeping straight through the night, but he did. At first, he woke before dawn out of habit, but then a strange thing happened. He didn't wake at all until the sun peeked through the window and warmed the wall above the cot. It was subtle, but real. The kind of sleep that comes when a man stops listening for the sound of something coming for him in the dark. It unnerved him. Trace found himself staring out the window longer than usual, fixing things that didn't need fixing, sharpening blades that already held an edge. His hands stayed busy, but his mind wandered to places he hadn't allowed it to in years. This cabin had been silent for so long, it had become part of his skin. Now it breathed different. The second chair, once untouched, had been pulled a little closer to the table. The pot over the fire no longer cooked just for one. The woodpile outside diminished faster than he was used to. And yet, none of it felt wrong. It felt unfamiliar. That was what scared him. He'd built this life to be quiet, self-contained, untouchable. And now it had cracks, small ones, but growing. He could feel warmth again, not just from the fire, but from the presence of two people who hadn't asked to be here, but weren't leaving either. And for the first time in years, Trace Calder felt something shift deep inside. It wasn't fear of them, it was fear of what it meant to not be alone. By the end of the week, Rhea Redfeather was on her feet. She moved slow but with purpose. No fumbling, no hesitation. When she crossed the cabin to stir the pot over the fire, she didn't ask. When she picked up Trace's torn shirt and stitched it back together with careful hands, she didn't wait for thanks. She just did it, quiet, focused, like the work helped her remember how to belong somewhere again. Trace noticed every movement. He said nothing, but he started waking earlier, stepping outside before the fire was lit, spending longer hours along the fence line, even though the cattle weren't wandering far. He'd split more wood than the stove would burn in a month, working with a kind of rhythm that looked like usefulness but felt like avoidance. He wasn't angry, but something in him was pulling back, slow and steady, like the tide before a storm. The cabin no longer felt like his alone. He could hear it in the way boots tapped across the floor that used to hold nothing but his shadow, smell it in the scent of stew that didn't come from his hands, see it in the folded blankets arranged with care instead of thrown over a chair. He'd invited none of it, but he hadn't turned it away either. And in a place like Dry Hollow, that was enough to stir whispers. It started in town, like things always did. One man says he saw something strange in the valley. Another claims he caught sight of dark hair moving along the ridge, the kind of talk that rides in behind a wagon and leaves ahead of a bullet. Trace heard none of it firsthand, but he felt the change in the wind. Then one afternoon it became real. He was splitting logs out back when he caught sight of dust rising in the west. 5 riders, silhouettes breaking over the ridgeline like a wave that didn't care what stood beneath it. They moved without hurry, without caution, men who rode like they expected to be noticed. Trace set down the axe. The man in front rode a polished bay and wore a coat too clean for honest work. Creed Voss, slim, composed, with a voice that could lie in church and get amends by the dozen. Behind him came Hank Dobbs, broad-shouldered and dumb as a rock. Then Tate Booker, Roe Carter, and Dusty Maris, all of them looking like they'd come from the kind of poker game where losing meant drawing steel. They reined up at the edge of the yard. Trace didn't reach for his rifle, but he didn't step back either. Creed smiled like they were old friends. "Afternoon, Calder." Trace gave a slow nod. "Didn't figure you for the visiting type." "Normally I ain't," Creed said, swinging down from the saddle with an easy grace that didn't match the tension in his jaw. "But folks are talking. Rumors drifting into town like tumbleweed. Thought I'd come see what kind of seeds you've been planting out here." The other 4 remained mounted, eyes scanning the cabin like they expected movement behind the curtain. Trace said nothing. Creed stepped closer, brushing dust off his sleeve like it mattered. "Apache, they say, out here, in your land." "They say a lot of things," Trace replied. Creed's smile thinned. "You know how this looks?" "I know what it is." They stared at each other. Years of difference between them, but no confusion about the lines they walked. Finally, Creed spoke again, voice lower, colder. "You're bringing trouble on yourself, Calder." Trace didn't blink. He just let the silence answer for him. And in that stillness, the wind returned. Dry, restless, full of things better left unsaid. Creed Voss never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He spoke like a man who'd learned long ago that words cut deeper when they're quiet. His boots crunched softly over the gravel as he stepped toward the cabin, hat tipped back just enough to show the cool in his eyes. Not cold like ice, but cold like iron left too long in the dark. Trace Calder stood in front of the porch, arms crossed, back straight. Behind him, the fire still crackled inside, and 2 figures stood just out of sight beyond the doorway. Creed stopped a few paces off. "You know what this is, right?" Trace didn't answer. Creed's smile stayed fixed, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "Ain't here to make a mess, just trying to keep things quiet, orderly." He glanced toward the cabin, as if expecting to see a shadow shift. "Let them go, quietly, that's all anyone's asking." Trace didn't move. From inside, the floor creaked. Then Tiva Redfeather stepped out. She stood in the doorway, tall, rooted, shoulders squared like someone who had stood in front of storms before and come out standing. She said nothing, made no appeal, just placed herself between Creed's men and her sister, the same way she had the day they arrived. Creed sighed softly like he pitied them. I get it, I do. But it's not about sympathy. You think they're safe here? You think you can hold back what's coming? Trace looked up, slow and deliberate. For years he had kept to himself, spoken little, avoided choosing sides. Because out here, choosing meant consequences, and silence often bought you more peace than truth ever could. But silence hadn't saved Mary. Silence hadn't kept Evan alive. He'd lived with that. Now, another line stood in front of him, drawn not on paper but in dirt and heat and consequence. Trace stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, it didn't shake. They stay. Creed tilted his head. Then you're taking responsibility. Trace nodded once. If there's a problem, it's mine. The weight of the words hit harder than any bullet, because once spoken, they couldn't be unspoken. The men behind Creed shifted in their saddles. Dusty Maris looked down, fidgeting with the reins. Hank Dobbs cracked his knuckles. Rowe and Tate just waited, silent and unreadable. The air tensed like a drawn rope. Creed's smile vanished. He stared at Trace for a long moment, then glanced past him again toward the cabin. Tiva hadn't moved. Rhea was somewhere inside, watching, waiting. No going back from this, Creed said, voice flat now. I know, Trace replied. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of all the things that could happen next. Full of the storm that might ride in tomorrow or months from now. But Trace didn't flinch. He had said it, meant it. They stay. Creed Voss didn't wait long. By the next morning, word spread that he'd taken his men north, following nothing more than rumors, and the need to prove himself right. There were no tracks to speak of, no real sign that anyone was moving through the valley. But Creed rode anyway, convinced that persistence alone could turn suspicion into truth. Men like him always believed the land would eventually agree with them. It didn't. The ridge north of Dry Hollow was steep and broken, stone sharp as bone where the earth had split long ago. The wind cut hard along its edge, pushing loose gravel into the air. Horses didn't like that ground. Wise riders knew it. Creed pressed on regardless. Somewhere near the drop-off, the base stumbled. No warning, no chance to recover. The horse slipped sideways on loose rock, legs folding beneath it. Creed went down hard, the sound of bone against stone carrying farther than it should have. By the time his men reached him, he was unconscious, one leg twisted at an angle no leg should ever hold. The land had made its answer clear. By late afternoon, Brant Orley rode into town, pale and shaken. Dust streaked across his coat. He didn't stop at the saloon, didn't dismount to tell the story twice. He rode straight through, stopping only long enough to pass the truth from mouth to ear. Creed Voss was down, bad. The reaction was silence. Men paused mid-conversation. Cards stopped slapping against tables. A few heads turned, but no one moved. No one reached for a saddle. No one volunteered to ride out. Creed had come back alive, but stripped of something harder to name than pride. His lies had been heard, his pressure felt. And now, faced with the chance to repay him, the town found itself short on courage. Or maybe long on memory. By nightfall, Brant Orley was riding again, this time toward Trace Calder's land. The knock on the cabin door came just after dark. Trace opened it without a word. One look at Brant's face told him enough. He's hurt, Brant said, breath uneven. Bad. Horse went down near the cut rock. Legs broken. Might not last the night. Trace didn't answer right away. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes drifting north toward the dark line of hills. The wind had shifted, colder now, scraping low against the earth. Somewhere inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Rhea and Tiva were there, safe, watching, listening. Brant hesitated. Town's waiting, he added. Seeing what you'll do. Trace nodded once. Then Brant left. The door closed behind him, and the quiet settled back in, heavier than before. Trace stood alone in the yard, hands flexing at his sides. His breath fogged in the cold. Every instinct he had screamed the same answer it always had. Let it be. Creed had made his choice, had drawn his line. The land had answered in its own way. Walking away now wouldn't make Trace a coward. It would make him consistent. He'd lived by that consistency for years. Inside him, something twisted. He thought of Mary, how he'd told himself staying was the right thing, how wrong he'd been, and how much that wrongness had cost. He thought of Evan, too small to understand why his father hadn't left when danger came calling. And then he thought of Ria's question. Why? Trace's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the strain of holding himself still. This time the choice wasn't about survival. It was about who he was willing to be when survival was no longer the only measure. He went inside. Tiva looked up at once, reading the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. She didn't ask. Ria watched him from near the fire, eyes steady, searching, not demanding anything, just waiting to see what kind of man stood in front of her. Trace pulled his coat from the peg. "You don't owe him," Tiva said quietly. "I know," Trace replied. The words settled between them, heavy but honest. He shrugged into the coat, reached for the reins hanging by the door. The room stayed silent. No one stopped him. No one tried to convince him otherwise. Outside, the night had come down hard and fast, swallowing the valley whole. Trace swung up onto his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. He didn't look back at the cabin. Didn't need to. The choice was already made. He turned the horse north and rode into the dark, leaving the light behind. This time not because he was running, but because he was finally willing to face what waited ahead. The ride north had been long, cold, and filled with silence. Trace Calder found Creed Voss right where Brant Orley said he'd be, half buried in loose shale near the ridgeline, his horse gone, his leg twisted beneath him like a broken fence post. The man was conscious, but barely, his face pale with pain, his pride nowhere to be seen. Creed didn't speak when Trace dismounted. He just looked at him with a mix of confusion and disbelief, like he couldn't quite believe the man he'd tried to shame now stood over him with a rope and a piece of rough-cut splint. Trace said nothing. He worked with the same quiet precision he used when patching a busted fence or cleaning a rifle. Quick, clean, no softness. He set the leg, ignored the curses, dragged Creed up behind him on the horse like dead weight, and rode back slow beneath a starless sky. By dawn, they were back in town. Trace didn't follow him to the docks, didn't answer questions. He just handed Creed off and left the rest to gravity and rumor. And rumor did what it always did, spread like prairie fire. The truth came out fast. Creed hadn't found anything in the hills. There were no Apache war bands, no threats beyond his own ambition. The story of a dangerous presence in the valley unraveled like an old rope in the rain. And folks who'd ridden behind him before started backing away like he carried sickness. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was a man who'd gone looking for trouble and ended up proving he was the problem. No one said it to his face, but they didn't have to. The silence around Creed Voss got louder with every passing day. Trace heard all this on the wind. He didn't stick around to see it firsthand. He rode home the same way he'd come in, alone, without fanfare, without explanation. When he stepped back into the cabin, the fire was still burning low in the hearth. Ria Redfeather was sitting at the table, sorting beans into a tin bowl. Tiva was near the window, sharpening a knife with even, measured strokes. Neither woman looked startled to see him. No one asked what happened, and Trace didn't offer. He hung his coat, poured himself water, and sat without a word. Ria looked up, met his eyes for a long, steady beat. There was no gratitude in her expression, no awe, just a quiet kind of knowing. As if she understood something deeper than what had happened out there. She understood why. She didn't see a savior. She saw a man who had made a choice, and made it for no one but himself. Trace nodded once, barely more than a breath, and turned toward the stove. There was no speech, no reckoning, no celebration. Just the sound of water boiling, the scrape of metal, the hum of a wind that no longer pressed against the wall so hard. And for the first time in a long, long while, Trace didn't feel the need to leave. He didn't wonder what it would cost him, because he'd already paid, and somehow what remained was enough. The morning came in quiet, pale light stretching over Dry Hollow with no wind, no frost, just a strange stillness, like the land was holding its breath. Tiva Redfeather stood by the doorway, her shawl drawn snug around her shoulders, pack slung across her back. The edges of her skirt flared with the breeze, and her boots were already dusted from the short walk from the fire. Trace watched from the corner of the cabin, silent as always. She wasn't lingering. There was no farewell speech, no promise to return. She hadn't even said the words, "I'm leaving." She didn't need to. Ria stood a few steps behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't move to stop her sister. No protest, no plea. Tiva glanced back, her voice low, steady. "She doesn't need me to stand between her and the world anymore." She said it without pride, without sadness. Just the simple, solemn truth of it. Rhea had her own footing now, and Tiva, who had spent her life guarding the space between danger and her sister, knew when to step aside. Trace didn't speak. He thought of what it meant for Tiva to trust this place enough to walk away, to leave her sister in the care of a man who, not long ago, might have turned his back without a second thought. But those days were behind him now. The wind picked up gently, lifting the ends of Tiva's shawl as she turned toward the open land. She didn't look back. Rhea stood watching until her sister's silhouette disappeared into the low hills beyond the pasture. Her eyes were still, not wet, just still, like someone choosing to carry something alone for the first time. Inside, the fire crackled, but no one moved toward it. Trace waited, half expecting her to follow, or at least speak. But Rhea didn't. She stood rooted in the dirt a moment longer, then turned toward him. Their eyes met across the space of the yard. Him on the porch, her at the edge of the step. "I'll stay," she said. There was no tremble in her voice, no uncertainty. "But not because I need shelter." The words landed with weight, not a demand, not a condition, just a boundary set clear and honest. Trace nodded slowly, jaw tight beneath a two-day stubble, boots braced on the porch planks. "I wouldn't want anything else," he said. They didn't shake on it, didn't hug. That wasn't the way of things out here. But in the quiet space between them, something changed. Tiva had gone, out into the wide, wild world where her strength still served a purpose. And Rhea remained, not as someone rescued, not as someone held, but as someone choosing to stay. And for Trace Calder, that choice meant more than anything she could have said. Winter loosened its grip on Dry Hollow like an old hand finally letting go. Snowmelt ran down the slopes in narrow, glistening ribbons, feeding the dry creek bed that had held nothing but dust for months. The earth softened, just enough to leave a boot print. Just enough to plant something, if a man dared. Trace Calder didn't mark the change on a calendar. He felt it in the wind. Less bitter now, and more tired than angry. He felt it in the weight of his coat, lighter these days, in the ache in his bones that didn't bite quite as deep, in the sound of birds returning, one at a time. Inside the cabin, things didn't look much different. The walls were still rough-hewn, the floor still scuffed by years of pacing, but the second chair was pulled up to the table now, used, not symbolic. A second bowl sat beside his at every meal, and sometimes a third cup of coffee was poured before either of them spoke. Rhea Redfeather wasn't a guest anymore. She was just there, hands calloused, voice sure, eyes steady. She fed the chickens. She fixed the latch on the barn door. She cursed under her breath when the stew boiled over, and laughed quietly when Trace muttered back. They didn't talk about what had brought them here anymore. They talked about what needed fixing, what had to be hauled, what wood was dry enough to burn. It wasn't survival anymore. It was something steadier than that, something worth keeping. One morning, Rhodes Kellen rode in from the north, dust clinging to his duster like a second skin. He didn't stay long, just drank a mug of black coffee by the fire, tipped his hat and said, "Tiva made it. She's up with a band on the high ridge. Word is, she's doing good." Rhea didn't cry. She didn't smile either, just nodded. Good, she said. Rhodes looked between her and Trace, then grinned. "Didn't think I'd ever see this place with two sets of boots by the door?" Trace raised an eyebrow. "I didn't either." Rhodes tipped his hat again and rode off before noon. After he was gone, Trace stood on the porch with a cup in his hand, watching the horizon. Rhea joined him, arms folded, gaze following the same line of sky. "You think she'll come back?" she asked. Trace didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally. "If she wants to, or not, either way, she's where she's supposed to be." Rhea nodded. The wind picked up, soft and warm, just enough to carry the scent of damp earth and pine. Dry Hollow hadn't changed much. It was still hard land, still full of silence, still the kind of place that didn't forgive mistakes and didn't promise peace. But this time it wasn't empty. There was work to do. There was coffee to pour. There was someone to pass the salt to across the table. And that was enough. The fire burned low that night. Outside, stars scattered across the sky like seeds, some falling, some staying just where they were. Trace sat at the table, staring into the flame. Rhea seated across from him, stitching a seam in silence. There were no vows spoken, no future written, just the steady rhythm of two people choosing to stay. And maybe that was the bravest thing of all.